Thank you. So it's my great pleasure on behalf of the School of Humanities and Communication Arts of Western Sydney University to welcome you all to this public lecture by my friend and comrade, Gavan Titley, The Debatability of Racism, Post-Racialism, Digital Media and Public Culture. My name is Alana Lentin and I teach cultural and social analysis in the school. Before I introduce Gavan and the rest of the speakers who've decided they want to be in the audience for this portion, but I will point them out, I'd like to begin that this evening we are meeting on unceded and hence stolen Gadigal land. I walk through the world every day on the country taken by force from the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is the very least I can do to acknowledge this fact, a fact that is not historical but very much actual, obvious all around us in the everyday, and to pause to pay respect to the Gadigal people, to their elders, past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the room. I say welcome, thank you. This land was and always will be Aboriginal land. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll begin by introducing each of tonight's speakers and then giving the floor over to them and sitting down myself to enjoy the evening. This evening is part of a series of events being funded by the school as part of Western Sydney University's commitment to its higher degree students. On Tuesday, Gavan gave an excellent masterclass for students from WSU and other universities on the notion of free speech crises in relation to racism. So it's fitting that we start this evening with Institute for Culture and Society PhD student Jack Gibson, a Wiradjuri man and community worker of many years. Jack recently published an article many of you may have read, I hope you have, and if you haven't, please do, called Media and White Blinkers on the Indigenous X website. And so there are many points in common I found between what he wrote there and what Gavan's going to be speaking about later. After Jack's short introduction, do you want to just wave out? No, there he is. We will hear from Gavan Titley. Gavan, as you will have seen on the invitation, is a senior lecturer in media studies at Maynooth University and a docent in the Swedish School of Social Science at Helsinki University. We've written a book together, The Crises of Multiculturalism, which came out in 2011. Since then, he's gone on to co-edit After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech, which came out in 2017, and Racism and Media, and there's a few copies of that floating around tonight. And the forthcoming Is Free Speech Racist, which is coming out next year with Polity. After Gavan is going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, we'll hear two responses to his talk from Luke Pearson and Sukhmani Khorana. Luke Pearson is a Gamilaroi man who founded Indigenous X, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in 2012. He's worked as a teacher, mentor, counsellor, public speaker, collaborator, facilitator, and so on and so forth, many things under your belt. Sukhmani Khorana is senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Wollongong, and she's published extensively on diasporic cultures, multi-platform refugee narratives, and the politics of empathy. She holds a current ARC linkage grant examining the role of television in the experience of migration to Australia, and she's the author of The Tastes and Politics of Intercultural Food in Australia. And after each of them speak, there's going to be time for questions from you. So please join me firstly in welcoming Jack Gibson to the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Alana, for that welcome. I'd like to echo Alana's words and acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, upon whose unceded and stolen land we are gathered. Now, I pay my respects to elders, past and present and emerging, and to those Aboriginal people that are present tonight. Now, I want people to earnestly reflect on those words and take any action necessary to have those lands returned to their rightful owners or equal reparation given. If you know a wrong has been perpetrated and do nothing about it, then nothing is done. Inaction is the form of action. So look, I have the privilege of introducing the speaker, Gavan, tonight. But first let me tell you how I got this gig. I wrote an article, and Alana read the article in Indigenous X, and we spoke, and she said, well, why don't you introduce Gavan? And so this is how I got the gig. But in the article, I took the ABC News Online to task for its one-sided portrayal of the shooting death of Common J. Roberts by the alleged murderer, police officer Zachary Rolfe. Now let me read an excerpt from the article. The article goes on to mention two occasions where statements were made by the NT Chief Minister Gunner and the NT Police. The statements in reference to their reticence to breach confidence said, as quoted, no further information will be released, and as this matter is before the court, no further information will be released, respectively. So, however, Gunner's reticence to not offer further commentary immediately gave way to his sense of victimhood, and as such his need to maintain and justify his and others' privileged white position. Informed by his fear of his deteriorating white privilege, Gunner proudly enunciated his hero worship of the valiant efforts of all NT police who go above and beyond the call of duty to protect. He especially justified the actions of the alleged murderer Rolfe by implying that he was only doing his job as a brave and fearless police officer. Gunner further bolsters the white privilege position by bringing to attention the brave, fearless and nonchalant act of Rolfe as a white saviour of hapless tourists in this case. Now Gunner wants us to believe that the hero Rolfe could not possibly perpetrate the heinous act of shooting a person without good cause. After all, he was just doing his job, which according to Gunner was more critical than ever to remember. So much more critical that such remembrance diminishes the death of the young Aboriginal man, it seems. Such valorisation is the foundational pillar of white privilege. The default of our society is the reproduction of racism. I don't mean racism or white supremacy of the KKK kind. I mean the supremeness of whiteness as entrenched in the very racialised Australian systems and institutions that maintain oppression over and positions Aboriginal people into some fabricated social order. The ABC News Online is complicit in maintaining the very structural inequities that continue to oppress, and this eternal deficit perception of Aboriginal people which informs much of white Australia's thinking and actions. Aboriginal incarceration rates and Aboriginal deaths in custody have not increased because the police want to protect us. So ABC, don't be blinded by the white. Now, of course, this fits well with tonight's lecture. So on that note, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Gavan Titley. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Alana. And I too acknowledge that we are meeting and discussing an unceded and thus stolen Gadigal land. This is officially a book presentation and a lecture. That's what it's called. That's what it says on the poster. Now, the last time I was at an academic book presentation, the author took this as meaning they should see how much of the book they could read aloud in about 45 minutes, like a kind of frustrated poet who was finally getting to do a reading. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to briefly say something about the book before moving swiftly on to the lecture part, where I want to talk about one of the arguments in the book in a bit more depth and to go into just one dimension of the various ways we can talk about the relationship between media and racism. But in this brief presentation of the book, I want to connect it to what Jack was talking about and to his article. my book is called Racism in Media, and I really just couldn't think what else to call it, frankly. So it has a title that in one way is a bit banal, and in another way it's a bit grandiose. It's a bit banal because it says here are two things, and there's a connection between them. And it's a bit grandiose because it sounds like I'm trying to say something about an entire field called racism and media, and it's really no such thing. The examples that I deal with, the case studies that I write about, the empirical material that I engage with is really drawn from the national context that I know, which are primarily Northern, Western European, inevitably a discussion of the United States as well. And so most of the discussion in the book is about anti-black racism, the racialization of migration, the enthusiastic transnational articulation of anti-Muslim racism, sometimes called Islamophobia. And so one reason that it's been very important to me personally that the first kind of discussions, real discussions or sustained discussions I have about this book are taking place here in Australia, because my book does not engage with settler colonial contexts at all, and as such lacks an engagement with Aboriginal and Indigenous thinking and political questions. So in one way, this title, Racism in Media, rubs against the approach I take in the book. As we know, there can be no general theory of racism. Analysis pays attention to historical specificity, the relations and connections between different racisms, how they're articulated in context, in and through social relations, antagonisms, political ideologies, different national imaginaries, and of course, what we're here to talk about, forms of representation, discourse, media work. One of my reasons for writing the book this way was a feeling that my field, broadly media and communications, which only patchily takes racism seriously anyway, had done very little sustained thinking about how an expanded field of media practices in a digital environment impact on the politics of racism and also, of course, the politics of anti-racism. So to talk about this for a minute, I want to take one of the central preoccupations of media studies, which is the question of representation. And I want to start by talking a bit about the work of somebody that influenced me a lot in thinking about these questions, Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall, one of his many contributions to thinking the politics of racism was his work on representation. His early writing on the question argued in a way that media analysis of racist representation needed to do more than focus on distortions of reality. So, for example, the over-representation of black British youth in crime reporting as a distortion of reality. Or it needed to do more than argue for the need to counter reductive stereotypes with positive ones, particularly through, say, forms of multicultural recognition in television program making. Now, Hall's argument wasn't to damn these approaches for being insufficiently radical. He saw them fulfilling important functions in their contexts. But what he argued is that neither of these approaches can account for symbolic power, for how representations seek closure of the real and the possible, for how media power accretes through routines and patterns and practices that, to quote him, naturalize representation to the point where you cannot see that anyone ever produced it. It seems to be just what the world is. It's just how it looks. It's what reality is. The critical task for him then was to try to open up the practice and process of representation. As he put it, to go inside the image, to open it and expose it from the inside. And of course, in his work, this was not limited to writing about it. In 1979, shortly before the general election that brought Margaret Thatcher to power, and I'm aware of the resonances of talking about this with the election tomorrow, and they're not necessarily good vibes, Hall co-wrote and presented with the actress Maggie Steed a famous one-off media analysis program called It Ain't Half Racist Mum, which you can actually find on YouTube. It's been left up there. And this was produced by the coalition, the Campaign Against Racism in the Media, through the BBC community access program Open Door. And there was quite a story to them getting the program made once the BBC realised that they were actually making the program about BBC materials. They suddenly got a lot less enthusiastic about supporting the program. The approach of the program is informed by Hall's work as he laid out in his essay of the previous year, Racism and Reaction, written in 1978, which set out to explain racism as what he calls a dynamic political force in Britain. That is, to quote again, the mechanism by which problems which are internal to British society, not ones which are visited on it from the outside, come to be projected onto or exported into an excessive preoccupation with the problem of race. It Ain't Half Racist Mum then features the two presenters opening and exposing, if you like, this preoccupation from the inside. They provide a commentary on how seemingly impartial current affairs programming is saturated with, to quote, the dominant consensus constructed by popular representations of race. What they find in factual, serious television is a constant set of narrative assumptions. The problems are caused by them being here, not by the hostility and discrimination that they face. Now, much has obviously changed in the social, political, and media landscape since this program was made, but I want to focus on one dimension of change, Hall's idea of going inside the image, going inside the process of representation. Arguably, the rapid expansion of a digital media ecology structured around what we call social media or enormous pseudo-public corporate platforms does some damage or undermines Hall's argument to some extent. You could say, as many people have begun to argue, that symbolic power now doesn't operate through closure, but actually through a radical refusal of it. If you want to do something reactionary online, as you know, you emphasize the artificiality of every image, the partiality of every narrative, the subjectivity of every perspective, the bias of every source, the multiplicity of any factual claim. The power of fake news, for example, is not just that some stories are made deliberately to be untrue, but that as a consequence, every story can be treated as being untrue. Symbolic power appears to be inverted. Yes, by all means go inside, we invite you in, but what you'll see is that everything is equally hollow. This is the logic, if you like, of disinformation. Now, one consequence of this is that it's really hard to know what to do with the question of representation in Hall's terms. Interactive media allows everything to be critiqued at speed. As we know, people tweet media critique as they watch something live on what used to be called television. Memes circulate as a testament to ironic self-awareness, splicing images and references together that circulate among audiences that either get it or they don't. So in some assessments, what this suggests is that representations have diminished symbolic power or efficiency, as it's called, and that analysing them is kind of a distraction from the real, from material oppression, from the fact that there are just images proliferating everywhere. And I think this is a mistake. Take the question of fake news. During the European borders crisis of 2015 and 16, disinformation was ratcheted up constantly and significantly by what we now know is a sophisticated transnational far-right media ecology. This is not simply media that is attached to political movements, but something much more sophisticated, diverse, multi-scaled, and eager to carve out a position for itself as alternative news, what I call in the book a kind of taboo news, news that becomes true because the mainstream media isn't covering it, so there's no way to move within that. It's only true because it doesn't exist on CNN or the BBC or whatever it might be. And one of the most dangerous genres of this news was the circulation of breaking news stories, using hashtags to circulate, using faux informational graphics to circulate the idea that things were constantly happening around asylum seeker centres, spreading rumours of violence, spreading rumours of sexual assault, and depending on the speed of circulation to increase the risk of inciting violence, and of course to officially deny, to officially engage with any of this was simply to act as communicative amplification, to make it go faster and to make it circulate much more viciously. But when we take these dynamics into account, what is fake about this fake news precedes its digitization. The asylum seeker as a parasite, the black-brown man as a savage sexual threat, the asylum centre as a ghetto or internal borderland. All of these are quite obviously historically resilient, racialized representations. And it's the importance of recognizing these continuities and the conditions that reinvigorate them, that weaponize them, that Jack captures for me in his article, Media and White Blinkers. Because under given conditions, in this case the aftermath of the killing of Comanche Roberts, media coverage can effortlessly draw on repertoires of representation which are already in place, and maintain, as Jack puts it, an eternal deficit perception of Aboriginal people, which informs much of white Australia's thinking and actions. So for all the complexity of the media ecosystem and the velocity and intensity at which images and discourses proliferate, we cannot lose track of how representations can act as part of the apparatus of race-making. This was not lost on Frantz Fanon, for example, whose discussion of the fact of blackness in black skins, white masks, repeatedly references the role of representation in the reproduction of racialized difference in the colonial metropole. He is, to quote him, haunted by a galaxy of erosive stereotypes. The white man has woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories. To hop around in time again, writing many years later, in the aftermath of the terror attacks in London in 2004, Gary Young wrote about the relentless media focus on young British Muslims, a focus that was often politely expressed, expressed in a language of inclusion and social cohesion, but predicated, he argued, on a very clear form of interpolation. This is my world, and you're just living in it. Eternal deficits, erosive stereotypes, contingent entry to my world. It's this kind of clarity that I tried to keep in mind in examining these questions under changed media and fluctuating socio-political conditions. And what I wanted to try to explore or account for in this book is how media transformations are generative. They do something to the operations of racisms and thus are of significance to practices of anti-racism too. And it's this latter question which is the subject of the body of this talk, which now formally transitions from book presentation to lecture, to focus on what these media and political conditions mean for naming and mobilizing around racism in public cultures. But actually, there's another book-related anecdote first. One of the central arguments of this book, which I want to lay out here, is shaped by a project that Alana and I did in 2014. I believe the verb nowadays is that we curated it, an article series in The Guardian called "Racism in a Digital Age." Now that I've mentioned Alana, I hope I'm not going to embarrass her by taking this opportunity to thank her for organising this trip and these events, which I think is entirely in keeping with the personal and intellectual generosity she's brought to a friendship and collaboration stretching over an amount of years that we are still young enough to count, but old enough not to mention in public. The idea of this series, anyway, was born of an anxiety in the Guardian newspaper that, and this sounds almost quaint 5 years later, that online comment spaces were in danger of becoming safe spaces for racist expression. I know, cute, isn't it? Particularly targeting journalists of Black, British and Asian background anytime they wrote about something. This was seen as sticking their head above the parapet too far, and all of this abuse would come at them. And so the brief was to ask them to reflect on this experience, but to move on from just talking about that, dealing with abuse, to think about opportunities and threats in this evolving media ecology. Now, the moment is important, as this was a period when breathless optimism about digital media, the kind of boosterism we all remember, was beginning to give way to darker assessments. Though you could say, as an aside, one of the problems right from the start in thinking about digital media was that by investing so much hope in participation in interactive media with these kind of wider democratic participatory hopes, you constantly get this swing between sort of digital utopia and dystopia, and also with a side order of Orientalism. In 2009 to 11, Twitter was helping to bring them democracy. Since 2016, Facebook has been destroying our democracies, that kind of thing. And I exaggerate only a little bit in that summary. So the starting point for thinking about this series was that these developments in communication systems can only be recognized as ambivalent. That has to be the starting point. And in thinking about this series, it seemed clear to us that the networked media ecology had done a number of things. Among them, vastly increased the scope and range of racist actors in the circulation of racist discourse. But at the same time, and to some extent that it's important to recognize, it accelerated the pluralization of public cultures. It extended the capacities of anti-racist counterpublics to respond, to critique, and to some extent to organize. So it's a diversified but not democratized media environment, and one where in important ways discursive power is somewhat in flux. So the task of contributors was to start from thinking about what this experience of their increased visibility in a digital media landscape and thus their kind of vulnerability to abuse, what this meant, but also to reflect on these wider opportunities and threats. Now, their articles generated a lot of comments, and I became interested in one genre of response within them, and there was, of course, a real diversity of responses. And this genre went something like this: I'm sorry that you've been getting abuse, but it doesn't sound like racism exactly. Have you thought that it might be something else instead? It might be this, actually. How can we be sure that it was really racism? Was it intended that way? And my personal favorite, well, here's the definition of racism from Google. I'm going to cut and paste it in here, and sorry, but your experience doesn't really match up to it, and I'm not exaggerating there at all. Now, these were not the kind of responses that are there with full-on, full-throated accusations of playing the race card and all of that particular reactionary heritage. But they certainly represent patterns of denial and deflection that are well established historically. But what struck me is how congruent, how neatly these forms of denial and deflection fit with the digital form, the comment thread, part of the digital media world's incessant invitation to discourse, react, debate, contest. So the political imperative that racism must always be proved to be something else, and the media imperative that there's always more discourse to produce and to circulate, inhabit each other. It's this set of affinities and their consequences that I try to capture in the book by calling it the debatability of racism. So let me switch into frustrated poetry reading mode myself momentarily and read a short description from the book. Racism in public culture is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The very mention of race serves as an invitation to disprove its salience. The mention of racism as an invitation to refute its relevance. In the contemporary political context, to speak publicly about racism is to be immediately integrated into an intensive process of delineation, deflection, and denial, a contest over who gets to define racism when everybody gets to speak about it. This incessant public contestation is shaped both by contemporary socio-political conditions and conflicts and by the integration of complex transnational media connectivity to the spaces of social action in which these conflicts are lived and played out. In the postcolonial migration nations of Western Europe and North America, this contestation centers on the dominant imaginary of these societies as post-racial, socio-political spaces in which, the story goes, the divisive idea of race no longer matters and the violence of racism has largely been transcended. The public cultures of these societies are also shaped by dense transnational networks of media flow and connectivity that provide unprecedented possibilities to both extend and challenge racializing discourses, images, frameworks, and information. The overlap between these two produces what this book terms the debatability of racism, the constant contest as to what constitutes racism, as to whose definition and voice counts, and as to the consequences that should stem from these fractious forms of public recognition and denial. So I use this idea of debatability to both suggest public debate and to mark distance from it, because debate remains the central conceit that we use to think about purposeful communication in public culture. Think about how when somebody wants to say something particularly nasty, they always call for an open debate or a national conversation about something. Debate suggests good things. It suggests procedure, engagement, the exchange of ideas, and possibly some forms of closure. Debatability, on the other hand, is a condition of those who condition that those who experience racism must endure and negotiate to attempt to speak about racism in public. It's a set of resilient, hegemonic assumptions about what racism is and is not, and how it should be adjudicated and by whom. It's shaped by the assumption that because nearly everybody agrees that racism is morally bad, everybody can equally debate whether something is racist or not, and debate it within media circuits that depend on the constant circulation of opinion and reaction in pursuit of the scarcest of resources, attention. This is more than white confusion as to what racism means. For me, it amounts to a mode of erasure or silencing. But whereas it's often emphasized that erasure or silencing takes place through the non-discussion of racism, the muting of racism, as Diana Ann Davis calls it, what I want to argue here is that the experience of racism, the operations of forms of racism, can be denied not only through silencing but also through noise, not just through a lack of attention to racism, but through an excess of particular kinds of attention. So this debatability, as I call it, this constant, incessant attention as to what counts of racism and who gets to define it, needs to be seen as something generative. It does something, as I said, in the politics of racism in irreducibly diverse societies that continue to be dominantly imagined as both white but also anti-racist at the same time. And this has political consequences, I want to argue, for those practices of anti-racism that try to name racism publicly in order to be able to mobilize to confront it. Now, of course, anti-racism movements and actions have never been dependent on agreed definitions of racism in public. Such movements recognize that any definition of racism is necessarily political. It's a site of political contest. And anti-racism has been enacted and articulated in ways that do not depend on centering discursively or practically or even symbolically the idea of racism. Nevertheless, anti-racism also requires identifying affinities and similarities in the experiences and histories of racialization, inflicted on different populations through dispossession, exploitation, securitization, exclusion, and increasingly through conditional coercive forms of inclusion. If racism, as Sivanandan put it pithily, never stays still, then the process of naming and articulation is often part of generating collective, mobilizing understandings. As Priyamvada Gopal argued recently, far from wallowing in victimhood, people who challenge racism are acting as responsible agents of change. At a time when the forces of violent racism are globally in the ascendant once again, we can help them by refusing to name it as such. Alternatively, we can do the right thing, actively acknowledge racism's existence, and try to rein in its power. What I hope to try to contribute with this analysis is mapping out the conditions in which this kind of active acknowledgement can be articulated, and the sort of forces and dynamics that can make it stronger or can also dilute it. And this involves, in what remains of the talk, saying something about political and media conditions. Now, given Priyamvada's warning about insurgent forms of violent racism, it might seem odd that I now reach for a discussion of post-racialism, as I indicated in the quote, as a way of situating debatability. We have a shared tendency in the Anglophone world to mark out historical time in terms of US presidents. So it seems odd to reach for an idea associated with Obama in a period when the election of Donald Trump has, as Enzo Traverso recently noted, heralded the rise of a new nationalist, populist, racist and xenophobic right as a global phenomenon. But what I just want to do here is focus on one aspect of what I see as important about the idea of post-racialism, which is substantive white control over the definition of racism, or to add to that, substantive white control over the definition of racism and a powerful performative assumption that racism can and should be restricted to a question of definition and is therefore no longer a question of politics. This desire for control is woven through a very particular kind of narrative that you can find in different versions in Western nation states where official, publicly renewed commitments to anti-racism are widespread and politically hegemonic. Following the defeat of fascism and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, both popular rejection of fascist politics and state and institutional efforts to repudiate the idea of race resulted in the marginalization of politics explicitly committed to hierarchical, scientifically inflected ideas of racism, though they are now, of course, trying enthusiastically to make another comeback. The discrediting of this idea of race and of regimes, movements, and past contexts that came to symbolize the totality of racism have contributed to a prevalent sense that racism is, if not thoroughly of the past, then defined by these pasts. Now, this narrative is a kind of a flexible weave, but in its hegemonic recounting, we could say that some nations have been freed of racism. In Germany, the idea of racism, Michael Meng argues, is shaped by a profound association of race with the Nazi genocide, and consequently, to quote, by the myth that Germans have successfully purged race thinking and racism from their society and politics after 1945. In the United States, the narrative of triumph over racism as a defining feature of its society, Kianga Yamahata Taylor argues, has gone through several iterations since the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, with the hopeful mainstream assumption that the presidency of Barack Obama marked the definitive arrival of a post-racial society, just the latest of these apparent transcendental achievements. Other nations, of course, have always been free of racism. Gloria Wekker diagnoses white innocence in the Netherlands as produced through a splitting between the imported German anti-Semitism of the Holocaust and the disavowed racism of Dutch colonialism. So to quote, while a dominant discourse stubbornly maintains that the Netherlands is and always has been a colourblind and anti-racist place, a place of extraordinary hospitality and tolerance towards the racialized, ethnicized other. Now, these kind of thumbnail sketches tell us very little, of course, of the ongoing reproduction of these kind of imaginaries, not to mention resistance to them and countercurrents. But what they do indicate, I think, nevertheless, is a presumption of national innocence and exceptionalism that provides a resilient horizon for public debate and public discourse. Central to conflicts over the meaning of racism, as Barner Hess has put it, is that political discussion of the meaning of racism seems to be over in the West. So contrary to Sivanandan's idea that racism never stands still and constantly need to find ways of capturing what's going on, racism in this dominant understanding across these contexts is, as Alana has put it recently, frozen. It's constrained to three key elements. To quote her, racism is the predominance of individual moralism, the reliance on an overly narrow, strictly biological and hierarchical account of racism, and the universalization of racism as equally practiced by all groups, independent of history, status, and power. So these constricted, dehistoricized understandings make it possible to extract racism from political economy, from social structure, or from the imposition of a social reality, as Jack put it, that then manifest themselves in the world as racist. Oh, sorry, I skipped something there. Locating it principally in the realm of ideas, such as movement ideologies, individual prejudices, that then manifest in the world as racist acts. The work of racialized logics and continued relations of capitalist exploitation and extraction to these shifting ways in which states produce problem populations that need some kind of management or intervention, it's difficult to name these as racism in this narrowing of permissible meanings. But this insistence on frozen racism is not just an obstacle to active acknowledgement, it's a tool of discipline. Because one of the consequences of defining racism in terms of its pastness and exceptionalism is that attempts to account for its shifting contemporary articulation can easily be cast or dismissed as defining everything as racism, and thus as attempting to shut down public debate. This insistence on fidelity to the accepted meaning of racism, which forecloses on how people who experience racism can talk about it, which is exactly what Renée Edo Lodge tries to describe, for example, in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking About Racism with White People. This is in fact presented as a kind of pluralism. It allows everybody to express their opinions, no matter how controversial or unpopular. So what's happening at the moment, I think, is that anti-racist perspectives that are not confined to this idea of what is really racism are in fact seen to be restricting freedom of speech. If racism is a question of ideas and ideology, and expressed always through intentional acts and actions, then it can and should be possible to prove that something is racism or something else. It's not racism. Anything else is an accusation, a slur, and as many of you might have noticed in the media and political world, it's increasingly regarded as a form of libel regarding legal action. You called me a racist, therefore this is a slur on my character, I'm going to sue. Now, we should not underestimate, I think, how this resentment of being accused of racism has been folded into contemporary forms of racist reaction. How this sensibility of free speech constrained, is that half an hour? Sorry? Okay, cool. How this sensibility of free speech constrained animates an idea of being free from all subjective, politically correct restraints on racist expression. Without this, many lucrative careers as media contrarians, you know these people, these tiresome generic tellers of uncomfortable truths about racialized populations for money, that now have a structural niche in media systems that are predicated on the competition for hits and clicks and attention. Without this, their careers would be far less viable, for example. But we can also take again Hall's question of symbolic power. Earlier this month, the Belgian town of Aalst renounced its UNESCO heritage status, granted because of its carnival parade, following years of protest against patently, gleefully anti-Semitic floats that featured giant hook-nosed Jewish stereotypes sitting on piles of money. These giant puppets were surrounded by people dancing, dressed up as Orthodox Jews, and singing about money. In October of this year, the Belgian state watchdog, the Interfederal Equal Opportunity Centre, concluded an investigation by stating that while these floats were clearly anti-Semitic, the creators and organisers were not being intentionally racist. But even this balanced application of the definition was too much for the town's mayor, who proclaimed that he was taking the carnival back from UNESCO to the people of Aalst, who were sick of the accusations because offence and being offended, after all, is subjective. The image, it turns out, seeks both closure and openness, the pleasures of public anti-Semitism and the resentment of having somebody else's lack of a sense of humour forced onto it. So finally, let me say something about how these tendencies are amplified and extended through media dynamics, while leaving more of the media reflections to our discussion after this. I recognise that very few public events are enhanced by a mention of Donald Trump, and I've already mentioned him once before, but I want to reflect on a recent incident that allows me to kind of summarise some of these dynamics, even if we're talking about mainstream media in the United States. We can at least think about them for translation and adaptation. While most recently Trump appears to have passed his evenings photoshopping his own head to images of Rambo, or at least directing an intern with above average Photoshop skills to do so, his late night tweeting over the last years seems calculated to ensuring that racialized conflict dominates the political agenda. As many of you know, in July of this year, he launched a widely reported Twitter attack against Ilhan Omar, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib, which culminated in inviting them to go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. Now, at some level, Trump has understood the generativity of digital media far better than his outraged opponents. And this is part of the rationale by which he has taken the carefully calibrated, crafted dog whistles of post-Nixonian Republican racism and refitted them with klaxons, weaponized them, amplified them. His suggestion that the senators cannot be real Americans despite their birthplace and citizenship because of their immigrant backgrounds is a suggestion that only makes sense to an overt association between whiteness and Americanness, and of course this overtness was precisely the point. The tweets sparked a firestorm of criticism, but then also something else, a rapidly emerging second order of debate. And this debate was among journalists who asked themselves, should, finally, the inverted commas come off the word racist when we report Trump's tweets? Not only, I know I go to laugh as well, but this was, as we'll see, a really serious debate. Not only did many reports do so, but many journalists tweeted to draw attention to the fact that they were doing so. The gloves and the inverted commas have finally come off. They were taking a stand. Now, it should come as no surprise in an openly partisan political field and a polarized media system like the US that the commas coming off enacted a further intensification of comment and the circulation of more opinion. But note the fidelity of these responses to the definition I've been talking about. It's a pity, Gary Abernathy argued in the Washington Post, that a growing number of reporters and editors have appointed themselves the deciders of what racism is. But it is the accusation itself, that he argues, that brought race into it, demonstrating once again how racism was a previously significant term, now being made frivolous by its abuse. Ian G. Hayworth also kicked in, asking where the journalists had found evidence of racist intent. Have you? Have you found evidence of intent? Without it, he argues, the goal of such a slur is simply to invalidate the arguments of one's opponents by labeling them as racist, conveniently bypassing the need for substantive evidence, objective debate, or logical arguments. Now, in part informed by this backlash, the second order debate about whether the commas should come on or off continued in liberal media outlets, liberal in the American sense, wondering now about the future significance and consequences of having taken the inverted commas off. On National Public Radio's podcast Code Switch, a weekly production devoted to reflecting on race in the US media, senior NPR editors disagreed not only about the decision of their news team to run a headline without the commas, but on the criteria that should be used to make that decision. For one editor who was supportive of the decision, the clear lineage of Trump's comments made them factually racist, and thus this was a call that remained within the realm of journalism rather than the realm of politics. For his dissenting colleague, who personally agreed that Trump was a mega-racist, this element of subjective judgment could never be removed from such an editorial decision, and so this risked, he argued, making the post-truth era worse. It would diminish public trust in the institution of journalism. Now, this vision of the public that they're discussing is illuminating, for in a volatile and fragmented audience landscape, where who is actually part of the audience for a media platform, this fear of mentioning racism and thus being seen as being too political and alienating audiences is widely pronounced. But I have never, even in a context as progressive as this NPR discussion, heard this inverted. What of the public that is alienated by a refusal to name racism as racism? But the circuits of debatability do not end there. Covering this story in the UK, the day after Trump had tweeted, Dan Walker, a host on BBC Breakfast, noted the recognisable trope of being asked where you come from or told to go home, and asked his co-host Naga Munchetty how she felt when confronted with this kind of logic. As a woman of colour, she responded, she had several experiences of being told to go back where I come from, an idea that, to quote her, is embedded in racism. Now, I'm not accusing anyone of anything here, but you know what certain phrases mean. In September, on the back of a single complaint to the BBC's editorial complaints unit, this internal disciplinary body found that she had breached the corporation's impartiality guidelines. This decision was met, as you can imagine, with significant public criticism, but its implications were clear. Munchetty, despite being asked by her co-host, had failed to be balanced and objective on the question of racism. A powerful open letter from, quote to quote, a group of people of colour working in media and broadcasting in the UK made the point that to suggest a journalist can talk about her own experiences of racism while withholding a critique of the author of racism, in this case President Trump, has the ludicrous implication that such racism may be legitimate and should be contemplated as such. What do we have running through these examples, to sum it up in a very potted kind of way? There's a fetish for balance. Everything has two sides, or everything must be given two sides, but no more than two sides. The professional fiction of non-political impartiality, generic constraints on what can be said and how, a default imagination of white publics as who we talk to when we're really talking about something. In these two final examples, the professional routines shape how circuits of debatability produce their noise, produce this surplus of the wrong kind of attention. In the NPR case, and I have to note here that perhaps these discussions happened in other fora, what struck me most was the lack of a discussion of what happens now that the inverted commas are off, what happens next. In these circuits of debatability, it was this gesture that became the focus of debate, and so the inverted commas were in the end nothing more than an alternative full stop. The professional inability to admit of racism as inherently political blocks any further discussion of how journalism can integrate an attention to racism and how it conceives of and interacts with its publics, and most centrally, interacts with those who are being made the subjects of these debates. The BBC case shook out differently because for one moment, the combined power of those who signed the letter forced the BBC to climb down on the idea that racism is, to quote the letter, just another opinion. But this was star power, not Labour power, because unlike the campaigns that cooperated with Stuart Hall to make It Ain't Half Racist Mum, there's little prospect of mobilising this kind of power in a sustained intervention in how mainstream journalism works. Now, I don't mean to sound pessimistic by ending there, but I'd much rather take this consideration of what is to be done to our discussion, and especially with contributors who have been doing precisely these things, and a discussion that I'm sure will also take us away from this somewhat limited focus on mainstream media making. My focus here in this talk has simply been on conditions and taking seriously the problem of debatability's noise for the right of people who are subject to racism to define it politically and describe and contest it in terms adequate to their experience and political struggle. Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, everyone. Thank you for that. First off, there's so many points. It's so hard when you're asked to give a response to a 30-minute talk. So, oh, I've gone that one. No, I've gone. But you know what? Sorry for anyone who came. Luke Pearson, founder of Indigenous X, other things. A lot of where Indigenous X has come from is really critique and reflection on media and racism in media, and striving to create a space for Indigenous people to have opportunities, not just to respond to the racism that comes from media, because I find that quite limiting, although it's crucially important. It's something I personally enjoy doing a lot of, the idea that we have a space that only exists to respond to racism and to whiteness. Would be reductive. So Indigenous X exists as a space for Indigenous people to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Just so happens I spend a lot of my time picking racism in media is the thing I like to talk about. There was something I think that underpins a lot of it that goes back to what you were saying, Jack, at the start, that idea of white supremacy not in the KKK form, but in the everyday form. Because if you go and you do a survey amongst Australia, most Western countries, like what do you think of when you think of white supremacy? And you get skinheads and KKK, and that's about it. That's what white supremacy is, that's what it looks like. And completely forgetting that, you know, throughout the last 400 years or so, white supremacy was just the norm. It was just a built-in assumption of how the world operates, and the rightful place of certain peoples within a very single line of human evolution, of human ability, of human capacity. And so this idea that we're in a post-racial, non-racist world, or that racism in media needs to be debated. I mean, I used to do high school debating, I did parliamentary debating, I loved that shit, I was a nerd as a kid. But the very premise of having a debate, there's got to be an adjudicator. There's someone at the end who listens to each side and then will make their decision. And just like the BBC example and so many of our institutional examples, or the realm of public debate as seen through the media, is usually that white adjudicator, because there's an inherent implied bias with non-white people talking about the issue of racism. So, well, of course you think that you're Aboriginal. Whereas for me to say, well, of course you think that you're white, is how dare you? You know, whiteness is allowed to have the complexities that we see represented through media. So we have white heroes, we have white villains, we have white mothers and fathers, good guys, bad guys, everything in between. The entire realm of human possibility is regularly and unflinchingly represented through media. When it comes to everyone else, we are so often pigeonholed into certain spaces. And so that limiting construction reinforces white supremacy, reinforces these norms of the dehumanised other, the humanised whiteness. The fact that if we say, or if you read in the newspaper, a 36-year-old Sydney man, blah, 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 you just assume they were white, because of course they were white, because if they weren't white, it would have said a 36-year-old Aboriginal, 36-year-old Muslim. Where that actually gets really problematic is that actually isn't always true. So I'm not an academic, so when I say I did research, it's just me nerding out at home on my computer. But I did research into that's what research is. I don't get paid for it, I guess, is the difference. But I was looking at times when Aboriginal people weren't identified as Aboriginal in media reporting, and it was really fascinating. And when you look into a lot of style guides, most of them, if they say anything at all, will say a race of an individual should only be mentioned when it's relevant to the story. And that to me is one of the most fascinating concepts. Like, when is it not relevant that I am me in a story that is about me? And so obviously you can't tell everything about me in any story about me, but this idea that someone would go, oh no, this is just about Luke doing something else, it doesn't matter that he's Aboriginal in that story. And so one of the stories was a woman, and this is actually what instigated me looking into this, was a woman in Logan who got shot in the eye with a taser on her lawn arguing with police. And anyone who's like, obviously she is Aboriginal. Like, that is not a white woman getting shot in the eyeball with a freaking taser on the front lawn of her own house, unarmed. That's just not a thing that would happen. But I had to look through like 10 articles before I could find something that acknowledged she was Aboriginal. So it was deemed not relevant to the story, as though the issue of racialised violence, over policing, racial stereotypes doesn't exist, but to acknowledge her race within that would have been to open up that box that they didn't want to open up in the reporting of. Another one was an Aboriginal man in Darwin who saved a family from drowning in their car. What's race got to do with that? And it's like, well, again, when we're denied heroes, when we are racialised to the point of implied criminality and deviancy within Aboriginality, well then having a hero is not a bad thing. But again, who would get to determine is his race relevant or not to this story if you're only looking at the context of the story and not the broader context, as though such a thing exists. We don't live in a vacuum. Everything is relevant to everything. But in the act of reporting, you get 200 words, 300 words. That's why we write with the inverted pyramid. All the important information right at the top, and then more and more information, so the editor can chop from the bottom up. And if it gets cut to 100 words, you'll get everything you need to know that something happened. But that pyramid, that premise, that everything we're discussing, as the work I try to do in media is like, you've got to provide context when you're talking not just about race, but talking about anything. Without that context, nothing means anything. We talk about one of the big failings in media at the moment is this loss of shared definitions. It's like we used to have a shared reality, and that's where Trump, by just openly lying about things we know that are true, again, Trump too many times, Scott Morrison, by openly lying about things that we know are true, is tearing away at this shared reality. But for many of the old school media people who are arguing, we need to go back to that shared reality we had in the 50s, No, shared reality was the one I mentioned at the start, which was the white supremacist, overtly racist one. It's like saying, yes, we do need a shared reality, but who gets to construct it? How do we get to attack it? How do we get to interrogate it? Who has right to reply within it? That gets back to the debatability of course, we need to debate things, but we need representation with the adjudication. We need the ability to rise above the automatic responses that white Australia are trained to ignore Indigenous thought. So, we put out a case story, you're just playing the race card. Are they just trying to make us feel guilty, or they just need to get over the past? Like, there are these built-in buffers that you don't actually have to listen to what I'm saying, because I don't actually believe what I'm saying. I'm trying to trick you to get those white tears to power my, whatever the hell it is that white tears power. That whole premise is, again, when you go back to the definition of racism, it's like, well, you think I'm innately deviant, you think I'm innately untrustworthy, you think I'm innately trying to co-opt and lie and manipulate. That is me being inferior to the superior norm of the benefit of the doubt. So I don't do conclusions well, I just talk until I go, that seems like I've talked too much. You don't probably talk. That's my thoughts. You got me brain ticking with a lot of things, so thank you again. And thanks very much for coming along.
Thanks, Luke. What do I say now?
Well, yours, rather.
Look, the sort of the two-sided coin for me is white supremacy and the supremeness of whiteness. White supremacy is bad. If we've got a white supremacist, we know they're bad. But if we have the supremeness of whiteness that is entrenched in everything, that is incorporated in everything, that is everything, then that's not too bad. So we have on one side, we have the very bad racist. Within the supremeness of whiteness, we have what might be called a good racist. Can we ever have a good racist? But we can have well-meaning people that are racist. And we have white supremacists, or the supremeness of whiteness. And they're very different concepts to me, and I think what we have, especially in Australia, is the supremeness of whiteness. And it makes things invisible. Whiteness is everywhere and nowhere. Due to this notion of supremeness, of everything that we do, everything that we say is predicated on the foundations of whiteness. So in this country, Australia was built on whiteness. We had the White Australia policy. That was pretty out there. It was pretty evident that all they wanted to do here was white people, of course. But the civil rights movement came along, and then the 70s came along, and then Aboriginal people started to protest. They wanted their land back, and whiteness then seemed to have become much more hidden, but nonetheless still supreme.
Thank you for that intervention, Jack. So what I'm going to attempt to do is respond to the book and to the talk by talking about migrants and refugees in Australia, which is sort of my research area. But before I do that, I obviously want to point out that settler colonialism is the founding paradigm for a lot of the conversations we do or don't have about migration and about refugees and the racialization of those categories. And the overt differentiation, but the actual implicit conflation of those categories in this country. Often we talk about migration, often we talk about refugees without recognizing that settler colonialism is the paradigm, is the foundational paradigm for a lot of the problems that we are kind of always running into with those sorts of conversations. And I have to pay sort of homage to my Palestinian friends and scholars and writers who do this better than a lot of us do, because they occupy, in some ways, both of those positions. But before I do any of that conceptual sort of responding, I wanted to point out a story that I read in the paper today, the Sydney Morning Herald. Did anyone come across the fact that the Australian government conveniently ignoring what's going on in Sydney, but has responded to an inquiry into the digital platforms? The headline was very promising. It said that these are world-leading regulations of tech giants. But whenever I started reading into it and really thinking about the language and discourses being employed in the official courts, as well as the courts of the Prime Minister, as well as the courts from the tech companies, I just started thinking about how these have a market orientation. So it goes back to some of the things that Gavan talks about in his book about the neoliberal and the post-racial paradigm that dominates the way we talk about race globally in this country in particular ways. So there's a shift in language in terms of thinking about how people are going to be interpolated. So they're not interpolated as citizens in some things that are being said in the story. You could argue more broadly, they're being interpolated as consumers. So just picked a couple of quotes from this article. So this is Scott Morrison saying, "We have regulation and systems that were written for an analog economy, and I want Australia to be one of the most, if not the most, successful digital economy in the world." So of course, the economy part is front and center, and then he talks about how it has to be a level playing field for all companies. So not a level playing field for people who are consuming or even just watching or looking at or interacting with the media, that's social media and mainstream media, but a level playing field for all companies. And then the article goes on to say that there were 23 recommendations in this particular inquiry, and the government rejected one of them. So you literally have to go down to the end of this, 500-word story to realize that one of the recommendations was tax incentives to encourage support for public interest journalism. And guess what happened to that recommendation? It got rejected. So I think that's a tiny example of how there is the pretense of trying to regulate, of trying to intervene, and intervention is also one of the key words which I think Gavan, you talk about towards the end of your book. The pretense of intervention, but if you dig beneath the surface, there is something else going on. So there is a recognition that there have been historical shifts in the media landscape, and what it means to the economy, which is opportunities as well as dangers, but not a real discussion of the socio-political implications. So of course, how is it impacting people's everyday lives, how they access social services, how they think about and interact with politics and journalism. So the emphasis seems to be, okay, let's regulate these giants because of the way they are interacting with mainstream media. And of course, mainstream media is trying to cover us and talk about us favorably, and let's regulate that relationship first and foremost, and then worry about consumers, but not thinking about the polity. And so I think that domo politics, I really like your analysis of domo politics and the way you applied it to the securitarian frame when you're talking about Muslims and how they are framed. But I think that we also perhaps need to think about how domo politics is being applied in the realm of digital regulation, which is only beginning to happen and has only just happened in this country. I also wanted to talk briefly about representation because it seems to come up again and again globally in your book, in your talk, and also in terms of what I am exposed to here in the talks about media and representation, diversity and representation. And it's also something we touch upon in the Linkage project, which is concluding soon on migration and television. And you might go, how did the government fund a project on television? But there was a historian involved, so that's how. But I think we did start to think about how do the regimes of diversity, how do the ideas of diversity and neoliberal reform and new media landscape kind of come together. So what does new media and sort of this idea of productive diversity do to the fact that we need to push for diversity, whether it's indigenous people or people of color? And it's starting to do interesting things. I'm going to sort of read a bit from some of our findings. Australian multiculturalism has its foundations in settler colonialism. This means that while the nationalisms in settler nations such as Australia and Canada draw upon the past for symbols, they are primarily oriented to the future promise of the nation. On the one hand, this newness can be a sort of source of uncertainty. On the other, the future orientation has allowed Australia and Canada to embrace multiculturalism as a project of national identity renewal. So such an embrace has enabled multiculturalism to have deeper roots in settler societies, as it is more intertwined with the very notion of national identity here. For this reason, the depth of multiculturalism pronounced by the likes of Angela Merkel in the post-9/11 era has received less political and populist support in Australia and in Canada. So there is often a difference between the multiculturalism of migrants and the cross-cultural consumption practices of the Anglo majority, which I'm sure many people in this room have talked about and written about. So I guess that we can then sort of extrapolate from this and think about how this is reflected in some of the anti-racist campaigns or even in some of the pro-refugee campaigns. Is it a sort of, advocacy without those people? And then there's the neoliberal and post-racial dimensions of the representations themselves. So in terms of the neoliberal dimension, it is relatively new migrants to Australia that are represented as solely interested in accumulating wealth and apathetic to more rooted forms of group belonging. So there's a series on Channel 9 which is widely critiqued called Here Come the Habibs. And later in the series there's a Sri Lankan real estate agent and a transnational Chinese couple that buy the Anglo family's ancestral house. You can see who's playing which archetype. This then raises questions about whether neoliberal everyday forms of multiculturalism and their mediations are a response to the limitations of official multiculturalism. At the same time, what are the pitfalls of marrying state-sanctioned multiculturalism with neoliberal policies? So in the previous book that Alana and Gavan wrote on the crises of multiculturalism, you talked about the individualizing logic of neoliberalism and how history, politics, and the state are increasingly written out of any analysis of disadvantage generally and racialized disadvantage particularly. So this means that capital is seen solely as a social corrector and not as one of the factors perpetuating discrimination. And in the sphere of diverse media, what this means, I guess, is that such an approach has very particular outcomes for the representation of cultural diversity. And we look at a number of genres, especially comedy, which moved in the 90s towards what we call the woke-exploitation genre, where a number of portrayals of ethnic minorities, even though they were few and far between, which used to be serious and sensitive, became quite market-driven. And that had particular consequences. So I think I'm going to, just basically emphasize that productive diversity has dangerous consequences for how ethnic minorities and also how indigenous people are represented. But at the same time, there is a lot of momentum around media debates about diversity and representation and a reflection argument. So I guess we're sort of at a bit of a crossroads in terms of how do practitioners use that momentum to get into some sort of loose notion of the canon, but still do the work of resistance, and which is similar to what you were talking about, Luke. So we do have to find a way to get in, but also be adjudicators. So not just a case of the balanced, objective journalist is the white person. We have to be able to talk without having white interlocutors, I guess. I will probably end with a quote that I read recently in a book called Ungrateful Refugee, which I highly recommend, by a Persian-American British writer called Dina Nairi, which kind of emphasizes the double bind in the discourses around refugees globally, but they have particular resonances in Australia because, as I said before, settler colonialism is the foundation for many of the things we're doing with refugees in this country, but also because it's particularly dangerous despite the low numbers because of the ways in which it is being translated and exported globally, and particularly in contexts like Europe, the kind of regime that we have here. And what I'm pointing out is the double bind that refugees face and the way that they're represented, including by so-called liberals. So here Gavan is talking about a particular refugee who's stuck in a camp in Europe. She says, economic migrant, they call him, seeing only his youth and potential. In newspapers and on his phone, Europeans are always debating how much refugees will contribute. They claim to want the economically beneficial kind, the good immigrants, and yet they welcome only those with a foot in the grave. Show any agency or savvy or industry before you left home and you're done. People begin imagining you scheming to get out just to get rich of an idea or a surgery or an atelier. They consider the surgery or atelier that doesn't yet exist as property stolen from them. The minute you arrive, though, even if you did have a foot in the grave, God help you if you need social services for a while. Thank you.